University and the head of the department who spoke earlier. There's a lot of material I want to put before you. You could scan it. There isn't time to read it, and I'm reluctant to read all of it. Some of it is by two poets who are here, Jeff Wilson and Francis Crook. Poetry at the Limits of Language. I start with a quote from Leslie Scalapino in a book that struggles to render in adequate form the, let's say, Iraq War, to put it in one phrase. The book is called Day, Ocean, State of Stars Night. Quote, "The real-time event occurring is the only thing that is, was." They've destroyed language, so we have to destroy it in it, not movement. End of quote. I take movement to refer to the outside, history, and unceasing change. And night, in her title, to be a principle of counter-reality in a situation in which reality has already become its own ideology. We'll come back to that when I discuss Sean Bonney. The aim of the talk is to consider some of the most radical poetry being written in the UK, but just some. We only have about half an hour, as a form of resistance, and as work which formally takes us to the limit of the language of poetry as it currently exists, and perhaps in some ways to the limit of language, hence my title, Poetry at the Limits of Language. By resistance, I don't mean protest, which stays within the existing order and its language, but making present what that order has concealed. Hence the phrase limits of language, since language is the main agency of concealment. This proposition involves another one, necessarily. What would be the basis of an alternative regime of appearances? This other dimension figures in different degrees, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, in the work we're going to consider. The question of resistance under the regime of appearances became acute after the banking crisis of 2008, which has obviously had an effect on the whole world order, but also I think part of what I'm putting before you, but won't elaborate, is the, let's say, tectonic plates of language and the visible order as affected by that crisis. Obviously, though, the question of resistance was there before 2008. My approach will be to let the poetry interrogate us as speakers and actors in a situation, rather than that we should interrogate it. Why? Because once we assume that we have a place from which to ask questions of poetry, we assume a place of knowledge. And the problem with that is the desire of something we can call cognitive, a place where knowledge can be made stable and thereby accumulated and costed and sold and bought. In the current epoch, the university is where statements that accumulate knowledge about literature, for example, can be made. So I'm proposing that the study of poetry can radicalize the university. Obviously, in the United States and Europe in particular, the state uses the word radicalize in a particular and different way, which is not the way I'm using it. Let's just take note of that. I'll comment on each text, but it's an example of the ruination of words, which I think is part of what we're discussing. I'll comment on each text or exhibit in turn, then relate them to the limits of language or the language. I'll also try to do something more difficult, which is to consider whether pushing against the limits of poetic language and form as they are also involves the limits of language as it currently exists, if indeed one can say that. I'm going to begin with Jessica and Benion's David Cameron. Part of the text is there. I tried to download it. The problem is I don't want to read it. having a male voice. So I'm going to play a little bit of a recording, but it's not precisely of that text. Why is this a good starting point? I'll come to that. This work exists primarily as a performance, and Jessica and Benyon themselves call it theatre. The subtitle is A Theatre of Knife Songs. Now clearly theatre has interpenetrated with poetry since the very beginnings of text. The part I want to emphasize is the one we've got up there, and let's just while you're having a look at that, just see if I can find this. Actually, we can't do it simultaneously. Find the recording. It's very difficult to see from here. No, that's not what I wanted. Okay. Maybe we'll skip that. We're going to hear it later. We're going to see a video of this later. So imagine a female voice speaking this in a situation of standing up in front of you. The piece is accentuated in a number of different ways. So accent becomes something completely different from accent in prosody, as in conventional classical poetic prosody. Accent becomes the articulation of tone, which is the deployment of words within a force field. The force field is made by social forces and their relations. So that is what accent becomes in this piece. The piece, I think, is demanding that we work out where it's coming from. It's interrogating us. A female person speaks about raping Cameron, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. We're right in the midst of a massive reversal of history because this weapon of war has been used by men against women. And then why propose that type of violence against an elected politician with a bland exterior and natural authority and so on and so forth? Where is this coming from? Rather than answering all the questions, let's consider the wish to pay back violence with violence. If you can't hear, just raise your hand. Can you hear okay? It's a little bit noisy. Pay back violence with violence. What is the form of expression of that action? It's not an expression of outrage where some sort of moral authority would be invoked. It's not a rant, and maybe someone can translate that into Turkish at some point. It's not a rant, let's say a shout, where extreme anger comes up against the limits of what's sayable. The act of raping Cameron is completely sayable in a straightforward way. It's not a metaphor, and it's not a form of hysteria, which would be a displacement of emotion according to the desire structure of the other. That is, I replace the real place where I am wounded, with another place which can be recognized according to consensus reality. So I don't display my wound, I displace it into a sayable and representable other place. As I'm hurt in my psyche, but it's my arm that's stuck. That's classical hysteria. And I think that the fact that it's a non-rant, that it doesn't invoke the sublime of what can't be said, and that it is not metaphorical and not hysterical in its form. All of these arise precisely from the fact that it goes, if you like, for the real, because it confronts what's hidden by the language of consensus. What's made invisible, what consensus doesn't allow. To say it quickly, is violence. That is, that the elected government is violent towards particularly people in poverty and need, but in general towards workers. So this performance, and towards the people who voted for it. So this performance text is destroying or undoing already existing displacements, which are in fact lies. It's destroying the concealments operated by the myth we live by in the world of democratic consensus. And I think that's why it's so explosive. So democratic consensus exists since maybe 1945 to 2008. A seismic change in the language. Breaking the consensual operations is also something that in a quite different way I think the poetry of Jeff Hilson does, so we'll come to that later. And what I want to propose is how we move from the poetic world, or let's say world, from the world of one of these poets to another is probably the most interesting and demanding thing we might be able to do with contemporary poetry. So it's not a linear series, it's a matter of different worlds and how one can actually move from one to the other and think and feel one's way through the mood. Here's a quote. "Nothing will happen anymore" is something that Alain Badiou comments on the world of democratic consensus. Nothing will happen anymore. There won't be any events. Because the language and regime of appearances prevents events occurring. Summary, quickly. A decision for revenge. Why is that efficacious? Revenge is a taboo. According to Walter Benjamin, it was precisely what the socialist opposition to Nazism failed to understand. Let's say social democratic opposition to fascism in Germany failed to understand that revenge is probably the most generous impulse of the oppressed. Obviously, it's forbidden by democratic consensus. Rape does not constitute justice. If you look at the text, you'll see why. Because of the passivity it produces in the victim. So there's a failure here as well. And then a perspective shifts from rapist to raped, and then back again. So the social is in those switches of relation, and the force, and the domination. It is in the end too small an act. That is something to think about. In other words, the inadequacy of that form of violence, which is a question that's very rarely, I think, asked by poetry. The inadequacy of gestures of, let's say, opposition. About theatre, Jessica and Benjamin say that, quote, its potency is in its failure to be properly abstracted from the forces it describes. It is these forces, and it describes these forces, which is the exact opposite of the consensus definition of poetry. If you think about it, it's the exact opposite of what poetry is supposed to be, which is abstracted, contemplative wording. Okay. Verity Spot, Gideon. Actually, the David Cameron text came out like that. You can have a look at it later. The Verity Spot book looks like that. You could have a look at it later. The only thing I want to draw attention to, this is a long and complex book, is the death list. So if we move down. Where does you get a death list? I think the death list opens up the work of poetry to historical forces and necessities. Or if you like, it breaks down the walls of the poem, which is a phrase actually used by Sean Bonney in some work on Amelie Baraka. It sends a high voltage shock through the reader and the listener. The gesture of a death list works as will to bring about a political situation, a particular situation or world, but also as expression or making of a subjectivity or making of subjects. It can be interpreted as an anarchist position, particularly from the opening of this section of the book. Create chaos amongst the rulers so as to bring down the government. That's where we start. And then we get to some language particles. Language particles, all sorts of obstacles come out in the lower levels of the language, obstacles to the forward smooth movement of meaning or desire. And this is not some kind of expression of incoherence, as in some forms of poetry currently popular, but marks of an agitated body, and language as a struggle of forces whose site or place is the body. So the resistance of the particles is a cessation, or produces a cessation of commodification, that is of let's say, market lifestyle. It can't operate, it gets stuck. Here, Spott's work intersects with that of another British poet, Keston Sutherland, who I'm not going to speak about, but we could converse about later on. The word magics comes in. So magic in this book is the basis of will. And here it is, will to destroy. Although in the revolutionary tradition, or certain revolutionary traditions, a death list is a form of terror that seeks to remove the social elements that prevent equality or perpetuate inequality. Another word, purged, here is equated with the death list, a purge, but it's also equated with orgasm and jouissance, the enjoyment that is irrational, if you like, and the political as including always that enjoyment. Therefore, the politics of resistance has to include that enjoyment. I would say this work presents a will to destruction and the limits of a will to destruction. We've inherited will to destruction from the early 20th century avant-gardes, obviously. And that the death list presents a mirror, a theatre of visibility to the invisible destructions of UK currently, but maybe of other places. It permits the real violence of the situation to appear. So the poetry is struggling in a situation where there is no real image of suffering towards a language that will have been adequate. I think there's a futurity view. Through a destruction of the language that is not adequate. But here are the limits. Taking the form of a curse, which is also a prayer, this book signals the limits of curse as preventing love. It washes its hands of having to confront the question, what might be an alternative order? Or what might be the order that in the tradition of poetry needs to still be upheld in order to write at all, which is another way of going through that. So the limits of nihilism, the limits of destructionism as a problem for the language of poetry. Thank you very much.